No.
Yeah.
Okay. So thank you very much for the invitation to this brown bag presentation. I'm Elena Basile, and this, I should say, very quickly, is very much a work in progress. There's so much to unpack in what happened last year with the Italian translation of Zong, and I, despite having intervened in the Italian debate last year, I am still in the midst of unpacking so many of its strands. And this might be sort of visible in what I'm doing today. And I just hope, and I really welcome the opportunity that Elena gave me to present in advance of a presentation that I'll be doing a week from now in Chicago. You will see that it is a bit of an unfinished work so far, so I'll take all my 30 minutes and more, and towards the end I will be more ad-libbing than reading my paper out loud. A small note about the image that you see on the PowerPoint presentation. This is a photograph that I took at Garrison Creek, which is now Trinity Bellwoods Park, during one of the durational performances of Zong, Zong, and it sort of depicts a series of white pieces of fabric on a branch, and the lantern there would be, because the performance, or the wake, I should call it, happened at night, is one of the many that happened. This was particularly important because it also tried to honor the land and water and the indigenous landscapes of the city, and the water that has been buried under Trinity Bellwoods Park. The performance happened, it was a durational performance that happened at night or at dusk, so this lantern here that you see would eventually become illuminated to continue. It was part of a durational collective reading of the book. So I will start with just setting up.
I didn't see it here, that was with the video.
Okay, if you can do it now. Sorry, apologies, I have to stop momentarily because there's a person that's going to help with the, showing my face that is speaking. That means Zoom is unable to detect the camera. Mm-hmm. Okay. And is it? It looks like it's. Oh, there we go. Oh,
There we go.
Okay. Are you able to? Well, that's zooming on them. I'm zooming on me.
It zooms on whoever will talk, so.
Oh, it does.
Zoom, yeah.
It kind of.
It delays a little bit, especially when a bunch of people are talking, but that should be fine. Yeah, so from now on, connected, and you can share your screen again.
Okay, that's perfect. Hi, everyone from home. I assume this would be good. You can just go back to Are you able to
Yeah,
do
the PowerPoint.
Yeah.
Yes, but
You have to share.
share screen.
Yeah. Well, either
This
one.
one.
This one?
Yes.
Okay, share.
What
Yes.
would that be?
And then you put in all the invitation. Okay, yeah.
Okay, so I'm.
Go back.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay,
Okay.
thank you. No problem. So I will stay for a minute on this image. Okay, then, yeah, I want to minimize the. Uh, yeah, and just put, can you put me up in the corner? It doesn't do it, right? Should. Yeah, there we go. Okay.
If you click the left.
Yeah, thank you.
Here.
Perfect, okay, let's start. So I've given you a little bit of context of the image. And I'll now start reading. I'm not in the.
Still not.
Okay. Oh, thank you. Maybe I have to speak louder. Okay. So this paper takes its cue from a controversy around the Italian translation of the long poem Song, which erupted in the fall of 2021 after its author, Black Caribbean-Canadian poet Elena Basile, publicly called for the destruction of the Italian book. The case, I will argue, draws attention to some of the deepest affective, economic, legal, and spiritual entanglements of coloniality, which presently regulate literary translation practices in the global north, in this specific case, Italy, and constitutes one among many sites of ongoing conflictual re-traumatization of historical wrongs, whose radical demand for justice requires both a deep disinvestment from unsituated floating claims to universality in the adjudication of transitive value, and a substantive commitment to restorative and reparative protocol of cultural negotiations in translation. At the center of such a double move away from colonial habits of valuation and towards reparative or repatriative practices of translation, I propose that we consider the question of care. This particular word, in fact, was invoked multiple times and in deeply dissonant ways by the conflicting parties involved in the controversy over the Italian publication of Song. The author on one side and the translator and the Italian publisher on the other. Becoming a site of deeply harmful equivocation, but also, I suggest, potentially a site of reparation in its aftermath. And I'm stressing potentially because this is an ongoing controversy in the sense that it might have died down in terms of the eruption that happened, but the statements, the opposing statements of the Italian publisher and of the author are up online, are still there, and there doesn't seem to be, as much as the Italian translation was eventually retired from circulation by the American publisher, actually. There has been no apology to date by the Italian publisher. The translator herself is trying to repair relations with the author. But there remain circulating online oppositional statement that could at any one point still be taken up for some kind of legal battle, which is what the author at some point was hoping to achieve, and possibly, I don't know quite yet when Philip is at this stage with it. This paper is a sustained exploration or an attempt to explore the question, exploring how the question of care emerged and played out in the controversy, and what kind of reparative work it could potentially become a guideline for in view of the current urgent need. Both different forms need to both to address different forms of colonial unknowing that are woven through pervasive assumptions in contemporary practices of literary translation, and to surface and cultivate a decolonial sensibility in translation. I will start with a general description of the book, and then offer a critical account of the events that led to Philip's public condemnation of the Italian text and the controversy that followed, particularly on social media, was very fierce and virulent in the Italian context. It was a controversy in which I actively intervened, and what I will be doing is repeating some of the arguments made in the early intervention and attempt, this is kind of what I started writing, attempt to address, meditate on these cruel dissonances and the equivocations that kind of seem to swirl around this idea of care, but also around other assumptions about what translation is supposed to do, and the desirability of translation. So, part one, the book. Zong, as narrated to the author by Sete Adamu Boateng, is the title of a book-length poem by Nubeze Philip, which dives through the layers of legal mystification contained in a short 1783 British legal opinion, Gregson versus Gilbert, adjudicating an insurance claim over the lost cargo of a slave ship's cross-Atlantic voyage gone horribly wrong. It was wrong from the start, but I'll get into that in a moment. A journey that should have taken approximately 6 weeks from the west coast of Africa to Jamaica ended up taking 4 months because of navigational errors on the part of the unexperienced captain, one Luke Collingwood. The lost cargo were the so-called lost cargo, this is in quotation marks because it is actually the language used in the legal opinion, were 150 enslaved Africans purposefully thrown overboard on the order of the captain, as he surmised that it would be easier to claim insurance for the ship's owner if the slaves were to die an accidental death than a natural one. Identified by historian James Walvin as, quote, the most grotesquely bizarre of all slave cases heard in an English court, the 2-page report, colloquially known as the Zong case, constitutes the text Nubeze Philip relies upon to create the poems of Zong, and I quote, to not tell the story that must be told. And I'm quoting from the afterword, tanda that Philip appends to her text. Locked in what she calls the linguistic cage of the legal opinion, Philip sifts through the legal's report, syntax and vocabulary, first decomposing, then shattering its sentences and words, progressively reducing the text to syllabic soundings that coalesce and recombine in ways that A, expose the colonial legal order's brutal insanity, this is the words of Richard Douglas Shindu, performed a masterful reading of Zong, and B, poetically reconstruct the violent contact zone that the ship must have been, its chaotic, forced intimacy of languages and bodies and gestures swirling upon the ship on board. And C, it finally makes space to listen to the breathing silence of the drowned Africans, their spirit honored through the increasingly stronger presence of West African languages, cosmologies, and rituals on the page as the book progresses, and their haunting presence explicitly presented in a very dense landscape of text, which is in the book's last section, titled Ebora, a Yoruba word which in the book's glossary translates as underwater spirits. An overarching principle of visual ordering of the words on the page organizes 4 of the 5 sections preceding Agora. It is named in the author's Matanda, an extensive afterword in which Phillips recounts the book's decade-long process of gestation and how she became its own non-author, more or less later. And it is reiterated more clearly in a text titled The Gas, presented in 2016, which is readily available for download on the author's website. This principle, which Ghazal Bean's word constitutes the book's spiritual architecture, requires that, and I quote, every word or cluster of words seek and find a space in the line above, so as to breathe. No word or cluster of words can come directly below another word or cluster, and there is a constant movement upward to the surface of the previous line for breath. At the heart then of Zong, Zong is awake. It is a book both motivated by and substantially anchored to the need to return dignity to and honor the dead, specifically the African dead of the Marfa Middle Passage, the inaugural, and I quote, socio-ecological catastrophe, I'm quoting Fred Moten here, of colonial modernity. The book should be also understood as a ontological work, that is, a work whose emergence into being was pursued through active West African ceremony and protocols of care that demanded a seeking permission from the ancestor. And this is recounted in detail by Philip in the Matanda. Philip writes that she traveled both to Ghana and then to Liverpool, from where Zong first set sail, to pour a libation for the dead, and explains the work as rooted not in her own individual authorial intentions, but in a relationship of debt or obligation of spirit, but owed by later to earlier generations. A relation of debt or obligation of spirit owed by later to earlier generations. It is such a relation of obligation of spirit that is made visible in the book's full title, as told to the author by Sete Adam Boateng. Far from being a simple trope or literary strategy, this title gestures to the substance of the book's decolonial dimension, as it situates Philip not as an individual, self-possessed author, a conceit of Western colonial modernity that underwrites contemporary legal regulations of copyright and authorship, but as someone working in the service of the ancestors. Sete Adam Boateng being the reconstructed name of an enslaved man of Port Zone. That is, someone then whose authorial authority, so to speak, is deeply relational and spiritually accountable. Rooted, that is, in an Afrocentric cultural disposition that not only exceeds the narrow limitations of modernity's possessive individualism, but also reasserts its value as a cosmology, an onto-epistemology against the violent and genocidal erasures of colonial modernity. Both the text inscription as a wake and the way it abides by the spiritual obligations to the ancestors, Philip calls them protocols of care, then situate the decolonial dimension of the text within a deeply sacred and ceremonial dimension, and one that has come to full prominence in the 15+ years since the book's first publication in 2008. As every year in November, in conjunction with the anniversary of the massacre, a collective durational reading of the book is held. And I participated in a couple of them, and they're incredibly powerful. This said, I also want to highlight that Zong is a text that engages with recognizable, might want to call them postmodern strategies of experimental or language poetry, insofar as it hovers between legibility and illegibility and opacity. Here too, the decolonial orientation of the text needs to be underlined, insofar as legibility, the text legibility, is firmly situated in the colonial containment of the linguistically defined and confined legal text, its official codified English. Whereas the text illegibility, the opacity of it, it's woven through the fragmented words, the syllabic kind of shadowing that happens, and the silences and the faces on the page that become part and parcel of its reparative and repatriated intent to return, and I quote Douglas Chin again, to return Africa, her stolen goods, epistemologies, ontologies, and people absented from genteel amnesiac white history to a place of recognition in the collective global consciousness. Now, I would like you to keep in mind these decolonial orientations of the book. That is, its explicit function as a wake, enacted as a spiritual obligation towards the ancestors, thus with a visible proximity to the sacred and to ceremony, and its unsettling relation to colonial legibility. As I now turn to an account of the events that led to the publication of Zong's Italian translation in June 2021, and eventually to the author's public call for its destruction after a summer of unsuccessful private negotiations with all of the parties involved in the affair. These parties include the translator, Renata Moresi, the editors of the Italian publisher, Benway Series, the names are Mariangela Guattari and Guido Manzaglioni, and finally, the editor of the American publisher, Susanna Taminen, who was the editor at Wesleyan University Press at the time. I believe she still is. My sources for this account include the extensive chronology that Philip herself has published on her own website, a private correspondence with the translator, Renata Moresi, who was authorized me to quote her, and the official statements on Benway Series' website that document the Italian version of the events, the Italian editor's versions of the events. So part 2, the Italian translation. The intention to translate Zong was first signaled by Renata Moresi in an email to Moresi in 2016. At the time, Moresi did not have a publisher, so Philip advised her that she get in touch with Wesleyan University Press to ensure that she had copyright permission to proceed. Philip assumed that Moresi would be back in touch with her after that. This did not happen. 5 years later, in June 2021, Philip received a congratulatory email from Benway Series for the publication of the Italian translation of Dawn. That means that in the intervening 5 years, Moresi and the editors at Benway Press had been able to secure the translation rights with Wesleyan University Press and to obtain a Canada Council grant to publish the translation. All of this without the author ever being involved once in any of the transactions. Phillips, and I should add that this was legally above board, in the sense that at no point there was any kind of legal obligation to consult with the author. And this is where things get a bit dicey, but also the question of, what assumptions govern our legal understandings of translation when a decolonial text is engaged with need to be considered. Philip's initial reaction was of surprise, not having been informed that the translation was happening, but also of cautious welcome. Now, this welcome turned quickly into anguished disapproval as soon as she saw the proofs of the translation. And what you have here is an example of what I'm about to write. Philip writes, "The most important activity happening in Zong are the silences on the page, not the words. The central and organizing principle," and I'm going to, let me see just a moment, because I have, I'll read this and then I'll go back to those pages. "The most important activity happening in Zong are the silences on the page, not the words. The central and organizing principle around which the words are laid out in the section that follow us is that no word or word cluster can come directly below another, thereby allowing them to breathe into the space above. In seeking the breath in the space above, the words echo the action of those who were thrown overboard late ship Zone. They also resonate with the long struggle of Africans to find the breath and space of freedom. From the Maroons running from enslavement to George Floyd, whose last words were, 'I can't breathe.' I repeat, the most important activity happening in the text zone are the silences which are filled with the unknown and the unknowing, filled with potentiality and possibility, not the words. These silences, part of the larger silence, must be honored, formally and on the page. It is in honoring the formal constraints of the page that we honor the history and the memory of the massacre. And most importantly, those lives being named, erased, dismissed, and lost. The simple but profound rule is what gives the text its distinctive shape. And here comes the accusation, the really firm accusation. You have completely ignored that. And as a consequence, what you have produced is a travesty of the poem and a dishonoring of all that the work is about. And I'm just going to go briefly back to show where on the left of this the slide is actually a sample page that then Philip circulated of the Italian translation. And I don't know if I can zoom in here, but you can see where the words kind of cluster together in ways that do not respect the spacing. If you look at the English text, the spacing, there's always no word comes below another. There's always a very deliberate and almost sculptural attempt to make sure that no one word comes directly below another, whereas you find a few more here. And this is one of the sample pages. And in response to, I'll get into a number of layers of the response that the Italian translator used to sort of justify the absence of spaces here. But one of the things that the translator kept saying, or that also has in interviews, there was an article published on the Walrus this past fall, where it relays the argument made both by the publisher and by the translator is that Italian is a flexible language, it uses longer words, so the words, these spaces could not be respected fully. Except that this is a bit of a bogus claim, for the simple reason that if we, I'm going to go to the next, this is a page towards the very end of the book that is almost entirely composed of Yoruba words. It's composed not of English language at all. The only part in English is the top. All of the words in the middle in italics are not English words or English syllables. And still, you can see in the Italian version here on the right that even when they are not translating, they're just kind of transposing on the other page, something is happening. There's a really kind of lack of understanding that in fact those spaces are of crucial importance for the poem itself. So even that justification for not respecting that kind of technical detail that the Italians sort of grasped on doesn't really hold much water. It really was a question of margins here, a simple question of margins. A lot could be said about the fact that when the publisher contacted Philip, the book was already out. The book was already in print. So it would have been incredibly costly for the publisher to go back and redo this. Now, it would have been okay if they said, look, it's really costly to do this. But you will see that the line of defense that the Italian publisher took for kind of claiming the validity and the value of the translation ends up actually inflicting, repeating the harm, ironically re-traumatizing and minimizing the author's objection. So let me go back to this. Oops. Oh, I guess I can just use. So to this statement, to this firm statement of a spiritual and political dimension of the poetics of breath that underlie the book as a whole, all of the actors involved immediately Their first response was by reassuring the author of the legality and of the objective professionalism of the translated text and the translator, insofar as the rights had been regularly purchased and the translation had gone through an anonymous peer reviewer. And then came the second strategy of defense was this minimizing and justifying the differences in layout by means of pointing to the linguistic difference in average word length between English and Italian. So here is just a sample. This back and forth, this correspondence went on for 3 months between July and September. So all summer of 2021, attempts to negotiate. And what is notable, what strikes myself while I read it, is an ongoing kind of eliding of misrecognition of the author's objection, and saying of the ontological weight of the author's objection. So here you read, but we are deeply saddened that your first impression of our work on your book was negative. Renata Moresi is extremely skilled, multi-award winning poet. So a displacement on sort of some kind of universal guarantee of the appropriateness of the translator, rather than an engaging with the terms of the poetics that the poet is articulating. As a matter of fact, before Susanna agreed to give Benway Series the translation rights of your book, a first draft of the translation was anonymously peer-reviewed in very positive terms, etc., etc. So you get this. What I argue here is that there is a very obvious and visible misrecognition and displacement of value in these early exchanges between the author and what I will call here the social assemblage of translation that forms around the Italian publication, whereby the publishers and the translators' defense of their own work invokes criteria of cultural legitimation that are not only exterior and unrelated to the text declared poetics, but they also evade a substantive acknowledgement of the validity of Philip's objection. Like, she repeats this idea that this is a reparative text that has a sacred aspect to it over and over and over again, only to be constantly kind of dismissed, put aside. It does not take long for Philip to name the racist undertones of these defensive moves, insofar as their substantial bypassing and minimizing of the spiritual political significance of the poem's formal core properties, its poetics of breath inscribed in its spacing rule, is a substantial bypassing and minimizing and erasure of the text blackness, its rootedness in Black diasporic cultures, and their unwavering commitment, and here I quote from another letter that Philip sends to Susanna Caminen, to piecing together broken histories, fragmented lives, lost cultures, and healing the historical trauma that underpins the history of Black and African descendant people. So on September 2021, Philip writes just on the eve, she threatens to go public and eventually does go public. And she writes to Caminen, Mazzaioli, Guattari, and Moresi, to all of the parties involved. She writes, from its inception to its end, the entire process of this translation mirrors the transactional relations and the racism that resulted in the transatlantic trade in Africans and the Zong massacre in particular. It is a process that makes a travesty of the care and attention that are at the heart of Zong, in both the preparatory work and its composition. Now, Philip's diagnosis of the problem and her unequivocal condemnation of the Italian translation as a work that unwittingly reinscribes the same logic of ontological erasure that had legally turned 150 people into insurable cargo, highlights the deep harm and the re-traumatization which the publishers and the translators' defensive responses had subjected her to. With no other recourse, on September 1st, 2021, Philip went public with her condemnation of the book, first publishing an account on the journal Caribbean Literature 3, then posting on Facebook, and finally starting an online petition calling for, and I quote, the immediate destruction of the unauthorized translation of Zong. While the petition quickly gathered more than 1,200 signatures and the support of American and Canadian organizations such as PEN America and Canada's Literary Translators Association, LTAC, ABC, PLC, and I have to say here, for full disclosure, that I was involved in actually the statement in support of Philip's position. The author's aggressive call for the book's destruction and her explicit naming of the affair as a case of systemic anti-Black racism driven by transactional considerations, as in it would have cost the publisher too much to reprint the book with the correct spaces, and by a willful disregard of the protocols of care for the ancestors that are embedded in the book. This naming also gathered a lot of backlash, as any public accusation of racism quickly does when a majoritarian white public feels directly interpolated. After all, the controversy over the Dutch translation of Amanda Gorman's The Hill We Climb had just died down a few months earlier. And on social media, the author's opposition to the Italian work was quickly reduced to being about an ad hominem attack on the whiteness of the translator and the publishers, and thus being in some quarters derogatorily perceived as an instance of cancel culture and reverse racism. I have to say that some of those arguments circulated more promptly within the Italian context. And they did circulate that way because of the public statement that, in fact, the publishers, the Italian publishers released. In fact, such a reductionist reading de facto informs the Benway Series official statement, which is still visible on their website. And I'll leave it here. I'm not reading it, but I'll leave it here for you to look at. In the statement, they defend the decision to take what they call the institutional route and not consult with the author out of, they say, respect for her time. Two, they interpret the author's condemnation as an unfortunate case of racial essentialism. And three, affirm that the author is engaging in what they call a dangerous undermining of the practice of translation, especially in view of what they call a power imbalance between the near universal power of English and the minor status of Italian. Notable in this statement are actually a series of rhetorical moves that both individualize the author's concerns, that is, they do not take into account the wider cultural, political accountabilities to the Black diaspora that are embedded in the work, and that the author insisted upon all along. And do this work of delinking the author from the text in such a way that the question and the practice of care no longer applies to the text's spiritual obligations of repair, but to what they call its graphic rendering. And here I kind of want to read the middle of the declaration. Benway claims validity and legitimacy for the book, both in terms of poetic rendition and in terms of the graphic rendering of the text, which is being elaborated and produced with the utmost care. If the current, and notice here what happens next, if the current outcome is not to the author's enjoyment. So notice the way in which the argument is made here anonymous. It's the individual author. It's almost as if she's, and this is a far more obvious in a number of responses, a kind of hysterization of the author's words, as if she's kind of the mad woman taking on something that everyone else assumes is a needed work, is a needed translation, and so forth. If the current outcome is not to the author's enjoyment, reasons are traceable to either misunderstanding or lack of communication. Certainly not to a lack of good faith in pursuing it. Here, I am less interested in pursuing the kind of obvious disavowal of racism pursued by the statement. And there are, I know that Richard Douglas Chin and Fizal Dean are presently busy writing an extended analysis of the fact of what the statement does and not does and misrecognizes. But in highlighting how the Italian editor's defense of their decision enacts a form of colonial unknowing that kind of extracts the practice of translation from its historical entanglement in violent forms of colonial erasure. There is a kind of obvious fetishization of the written word that's happening here, and of the book that betrays a number of universalizing assumptions about translation. And universalizing assumptions that again rest upon epistemic colonial assumption and disregard ontological considerations. This is where sort of things shift. One, the most obvious, an individualizing idea of authorial intentions. So that the author is delinked from the text. In the conversation I eventually had myself with Renata Moresi later this summer, while I was trying to kind of put my finger on where sort of the rupture happened. Moresi said to me, you know, we translate text, we don't translate authors. But again, when you have a text that is imbued with what the author calls silence, imbued with a dimension to it that is not codified in legibility, but opens up to the space, opens up to oral ritual reading and all of that. Something is amiss, something does not quite compute. And we need to take account of, you as a translator also need to be accountable to that. The inability to think of translation other than text, codified language that always lives the text always lives off the page, just poetical press is about living off the page, then produces all of these harmful assumptions. So the assumption of that what the author is complaining about is only her own intentions and are not the full accountability of the text as a work of spiritual obligation and repair. And this misrecognition led in Italy to some quite extreme articulations in which then I kind of intervened in, where literally one author intervened to say, this is, the author has no legal recourse, so it's just her word against the rules. It's literally what you say, and sort of you get this kind of historicization of the author's words, and the assumption that you could just, because the text can speak in and of itself, but then when the text is imbued with an anti-speaking, an anti-meaning imbued in those spaces, and you're not respecting those spaces, you're doing a deep disservice to the text. And there's also kind of this, what you see at the end of the statement, we think that undermining the practice of translation is dangerous, in particular in a passage from a close to universal language such as English, to a minority one such as Italian. And then you go into Bentley Series, it's a non-profit publishing project that deeply believes in the making of bilingual books and literary translation. We believe that good books can talk across time and space. What you see here is a kind of an invocation of the idea that translation is always a desirable thing at all cost, and it always is by nature dialogic. Again, it is a statement that is a free-floating statement. It does not acknowledge the situatedness of the ongoing colonial unknowing perpetrated upon this text. And it also assumes, does not acknowledge this idea that translation is desirable always at all costs, and always leads to dialogue. Again, bypasses again to the ontological dimension of the kind of objection. So the dialogism is a dialogism on whose term? On whose terms is the dialogism that is being involved? Philip, some of this is where this is where my paper ends, because this is where I still have, I'm working through some issues on this. Some of the debates that happened in the wake of the book, of this moment, insist on the untranslatability of the text. That is not so much what is Philip's objection. She did not object to the translation per se. She objected to the fact that the translation is not respecting something that is in fact beyond linguistic code and beyond linguistic legibility, the spaces. And she's saying those have weight. Those have an ontological weight. And here you keep kind of, and the defense keeps returning to, keeps like not seeing that, not seeing the ontological weight of that. And the defense, I should also say, was also quickly and all the defenses went up when Philip invoked the sacredness of the text. Again, the accusation was made back to her to say that if it's so sacred, then you're entering some kind of dogmatism. And the other point that the Italians made about the legitimacy or the need to translate this text has to do with, the actual resonance that this book does have in the Italian context, in the context of the new Middle Passage that is the migrant crisis in the Mediterranean. And here there is, and I want to end on this point because I want to end with another point about sort of the misrecognition that's happening or around the translation and its function. Now, any translation at any one point going into another culture context requires some degree of application, requires some degree of recontextualizing. Here, I want you to notice the way it was recontextualized by Renata Moresi, the argument that's made. There is an argument that keeps being made for the urgency of this text being translated in Italy. Again, there's a couple of things I want you to notice here. Moresi, this is part of the correspondence from July, when sort of in the middle of the negotiation, the private negotiation from a time. And she writes, let me briefly add something about the translation itself. Discrepancies in the alignment were not the result of random choices. So now she's kind of changing her story. Translation is about the negotiation of differences and the difference between two languages involved a different treatment of the space. I prefer to deal with the clusters as coordinates than to maintain the original spacing, because this would have meant in some cases a disruption of the line. Okay, but notice that word coordinate. There's also another reason for this choice, and here we see kind of the moral urgency of, and I should say, I never dispute the moral urgency with which the Italians chose this translation. In October 2013, a boat carrying hundreds of migrants shipwrecked out of the coast of Lampedusa in southern Italy. More than 360 people died, and this tragedy was a turning point in the history of the Mediterranean for many reasons. One of the pilots of the helicopters involved in the rescue operation later described the appalling sight that he could see from above, and how the pilots involved chose the floating body of a woman dressed in vivid purple to function as a reference point, in Italian called punto nave, literally ship point, to give coordinates and assistance to the rescuing team below. So I treated the clusters not as points pinned on the page, but as floating points in relation to one another, which could provide a form of help in this moment of danger, even after more than 200 years. What I would like you to notice here is where the translator is situating herself in relation to the page. The way Philip understands the page and tries to convey the page is a vertical palimpsest. At the bottom of the pages, you didn't see what are actually the reconstructed names of the drowned Africans on board. So, in fact, the poem is happening from below. It's from the grave. It's happening from the drowned up. How the translator situates herself here from above. The page is this flat canvas that unwittingly performs the objectification of the black body. Again, another kind of unwitting re-traumatization, the and misrecognition of the subject, chose the floating body of a woman dressed. We could call it here sort of a kind of, white savior syndrome being enacted on the page here in a very obvious way. And again, one that then also translated in Italy through the political work that seemingly this zone would be doing was actually to draw attention to the migrant crisis. But how and at what cost is it doing it? It's drawing attention, in fact, to the spectacle of Black suffering. It is not honoring the dead. And that continues to be kind of a turning point and a turning problem when it comes to the question of care. So to end, I was just going to say one thing. Zong, the word zong historically begins as a careless error of transcription. The ship was originally Dutch, and its name was Zorg, the Dutch word for care. The R eventually was transformed into an N in its passage to British ownership, apparently as an error of transcription. And we could argue that, in fact, there's a major error of transcription precisely happening by way of the non-respecting of the white spaces that do not allow the text to breathe. So how ironically apropos then that this word concept, care, becomes the most equivocal term in the controversy. Philip enacting its ethos of generational obligation to history, to healing, and insisting on its reparative value in the ongoing living dimension of Black expressive cultures. Whereas for the Italian, Pura remains fixated on a kind of fetishizing aesthetic of the book that de facto belies the explicit political intent that is about seeking to address the Mediterranean crisis. So I'm stopping here because I've taken it too long. I welcome questions or further observations or other things.
Thank you so much. Yes, thank you.
I guess I can stop sharing so people can feel free to unmute yourself online. Elena.
So thank you. That was very interesting. I didn't know anything about this particular phase. So it's a situation with this translation. But what it made me think about, and I'm not a translator, is translating E. Cummings' work, because I would think that at this point, that poets who are doing translation would be very aware of the importance of spacing on the page. I mean, I just can't believe that a poet doing translation would.
No, that's, I thought Cummings was, when in her outrage at all of this, Philip said that if Cummings was to be translated, would you actually take so cavalierly the spaces? Yeah.
Absolutely. In fact, I just, checked online and there's this whole long article about translating Cummings and the importance of keeping that space. So I can't even imagine how this began, how the translator could come to this without respecting what was on the page, especially when you're dealing with a living poet that you can talk to.
Yeah, that's another thing. When Philip started contacting people in Italy about it, like there seemed to be really a different sensibility in play because and Philip has been translated before in Italian. She tries to has been translated. And there was also an earlier attempt at translating Zon. Susan has a, I just want, I'm going to finish this. Okay, I lost my train of thought.
I didn't mean to.
When she heard the space.
Yes, different sensibilities at play in Italy, and she's already been translated into Italian. Maybe you want to tell us something about that?
Well, she was translated. When Phillips was trying to have some kind of recourse to figure out how could this happen? How could it happen? In Italy, the translator just said, well, you know, this idea that in fact the author should not have a say in the text because it might only interfere with, you know, not knowing enough of the language, not knowing enough of the context. There is a very the common discourse that is happening in Italy, or common. Renata Boresi says we translate text, we don't translate authors, right? So this idea that the author should not be involved, that potentially commits kind of interference, is very widespread in Italy. And I could see something of the kind with the likes of Milan Kundera or Nabokov. But in this situation, because it's not about the individual authorial intentions, it is about a decolonial accountability, something else that's going on with the text. It kind of again betrays this idea of this text-centric theory of translation that's kind of anchoring the approach.
Yeah. Can I respond to that? Because I think it's just such fascinating material, Elena, and thank you so much for making it possible timing wise, because I would have really liked to be there in person, but I did see everything and hear everything. And hi, everybody. It's great to see you too. Everyone there as well. But it's this notion of what text-centric involves. And I must say, I've just been working on this, on some work about dead girls and imaginaries surrounding dead girls, especially Euro-American ones as they play out, and especially things like CSI and how that makes itself all felt in art and things like that. So what I was really, really like, the punctum of your talk for me, Elena, was this reference to at the end where the pilots described, the helicopter pilots described using the woman's dress in purple. And that to me is just such a CSI move, right? And so I wondered what's happening in terms of the need to rethink text via different forms of media, and that transmediality is really what's at stake. And the fact that visuality works differently on the page than it does in the new media of television, which this all, I would argue, your talk seems to be suggesting to me that there is a remediation that's going on via screen culture and all kinds of things going on by it, which ironically are working against everything you talked about, the obligation of history, Phillips enacting an ethos of obligation to history and hearing, right? So it's all the listening that is a different modality than the seeing of screen culture, which is, I think there's some slippage going on around visuality and media, and I guess I wanted to see how you respond to that and what.
You're absolutely correct. And again, so there's both kind of text centricity and ocular centricity of how the translator goes at it. And again, I have to say, when I intervened in the Italian debate last year, the way I situated myself was in fact by way of invoking my visceral experience of the collective reading of Zorn. Where those collective readings really do something that no visuality, no silent reading of the text on the page do, which is put you, in fact, in the hull of the ship, put you there, and then, but in that moment of spiritual sort of deep listening, that in fact all of the ritual, the readings tend to happen overnight. So again, that transmediality is happening not through the seeing sense or the codified sense, but you get that embodiment. And it has, again, it has its own ontological weight. And that's where sort of that whiteness, that white space on the page that signifies breath, brings it all alive. One thing that I didn't show is the Italians, even after the condemnation, two things. Renata Moresi at one point says to me, in the hierarchy of the legible and the illegible of this text, I explicitly chose the legible. But then the question of the legible is its coloniality. There's no point in repeating the coloniality without making that illegible really surface as something that the readers have to measure themselves with. So, in fact, when we go into these collective readings, you are forced to sound the syllables. You are forced to feel the words in your mouth falling apart and recombining, becoming others, entering this multilinguistic forced contact zone. And that aspect, again, she says, in the hierarchy of the legible and illegible, I prefer the legible. And again, there's a pointed choice of kind of bringing the text back to that legible is the colonial. Again, that legible.
But it's not in Italy. It's the neo-colonial corporate visuality. I mean, I want to mess up that. Sorry to interject, but I think you're absolutely, I mean, you're getting at such important aspect. The way that theory also offers, especially trauma theory, offers a way to complicate even like her and identify the binary she wants to remain within, which is works very differently in the Italian context from your reading, at least.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, thanks for,
Yeah.
I think that you're really on, and especially the contribution that this can move into, that's why care works so well in terms of where it needs to take trauma theory. And I do think the media emphasis will really do something there.
And I think the whole controversy is stuck in traumatic repetition.
Yeah, exactly. That's the that's why screens, right? And repetitions and all of that. I think that kind of underpinning to theoretical underpinnings will really allow you to get at some of these dynamics.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. All right. Hi, Susan. So good to see you. Eva Karpinski here. Ages. Anyway, thank you for this comment. I really feel inspired by once you said, this obligation to history and listening, and then how you framed the context of this event of translation, the Italian translation, through these are the words that I was missing, like, the corporate sort of like, language even of those responses that Betsy Phillip received from the publishers, condescending, patronizing, sort of like even trying the use of the first names, right? Renata, Susanna, whatever, like, putting her completely outside of that circle. But I am also fascinated by this listening thing, because I've been thinking, and I guess theoretically song had been discussed together with Caroline Bergwald, which is related kind of, I don't know if people you know Caroline Bergwald's Bridge, which is another story, another migrant boat in the Caribbean. I think that was a little bit later, whatever, 72, 4 people died, the left to die boat. It was the callousness of, you know, whatever, lack of response there. So she wrote that. And this has been put together in the context of like forensic listening, right? And I'm thinking about silence here, your reflection on silence and what you brought out here, in the context of how, and forensic listening is actually a real thing. Like, you know, there's audio criminology or stuff like that, where you need to, how to use sound as admissible evidence in courts of justice or whatever, in cases, in legal cases. So it's actually fascinating how Bessie Phillips' insistence on respecting silence, and what Susan said about obligation to listening to silence, right, on the page, or it's sort of like in this context elevated to evidence, to something really, really important, right?
And disallowed.
Not even a hearing. Right?
Yeah, not
so I mean, it's and I think this is an endlessly productive example, you know. But what you also said about Italy, there's this innocence, right? On the part of the publisher, the translator, where, you know, another misrecognition of Italy's own role, right, in those histories of not only ongoing, you know, coloniality of power relations in the current world order, but also historically in colonialism, right? So it's completely erased, and there's total innocence. And then displacement, so there's misrecognition and misplacement happening on multiple levels there, right? Including, you know, the innocence.
Yeah, and it's all done in the name of responding to the urgency of fascism.
Yeah.
So, again, some of the and I don't discount sort of that the fact that there is indeed an urgency, but the politics around it continue to be very much like you know, the history of also abolitionist slavery continue to center white Italians in the whole, and continue to center to making the migrants the object of discourse as opposed to their own subjects that are doing something. So one of the other things that Philip says as to sort of the right of refusal of translation, that in Italy might as well, the risk also of fetishizing her own book, which is about transatlantic studies, about the African diaspora in the Americas. The risk is of building quick equivalencies that again repeat the spectacle, so repeat a kind of a politics of victimization as a ruse to, you know, to political change, as opposed to a politics of letting other epistemologies, other ontologies actually surface, potentially surface, or letting the ancestor breathe, literally. So and again, here comes all the question of sort of how do you understand translation in modernity? The entire sort of letting, not wanting to acknowledge that there can be indeed a mode of spiritual connection that modernity simply does not understand, simply has, or worse, not just has actually disbanded and minimized, patronized as, you know, the Enlightenment is the long history of the Enlightenment, right? There is a video of an actual performance of the Italian translation done in December 2021, where there still was kind of some books in circulation were still there. And it is telling, because the performer does one, the performer does not sound out the syllables. She puts the words back together. It really works on, and you put the words back together, and you really have, you know, the violence of the massacre being enacted. The whole purpose of shifting of the words being fragmented is, in fact, to not tell the story that must be told. And then you also have in that video, I mean, here are the politics of representation enters a white ethnologist playing African instruments, accompanying the white performer doing this ongoing violence to the page, which was, you know, not sound out the syllables, returning it to this legibility that in fact it's all of the purpose of the text to undo. And you know, it would have taken me an hour. Yes, Brian.
Yes, thank you, Elena, for as always fascinating and very thought-provoking talk. I just wanted to focus in on the response of the publishers, which was so disturbing in so many ways, in the sense that they tried to cast themselves as the minority by saying, you write in a hegemonic language of English and we're translating. But then in the final paragraph, in describing translation, they use the word passage, which is so closely associated with the slave trade. I mean, that was for me where the colonial repressed burst through the surface of that text, right? But just that comment.
No, thank you for noticing that. That's definitely, like, there's the ironies there's this, it's such a field of, even like the word hair, how that word hair gets completely, Philip just says, you know, they took a page off the colonial handbook. That's how she described the work. What I find difficult, and what I found difficult in my own intervention in Italy, is that I really struggled. My voice was kind of acknowledged, but then immediately after I intervened, a response came through saying, well, we still need a politics here. We still need a politics to address this. This text still resonates. Sure it does, but you cannot just let it resonate however on your terms. That's sort of the question that I have for them. I'm kind of still working through it.
Thank you so much, Elena, for your presentation. You know, you raise a lot of questions that are very dear to translation studies. And I have to say a few words because I'm a scholar doing research in translation studies. I'm familiar with all these issues. It's not something new. There's a huge divide in translation studies between theory and practice, between research and profession. It's very difficult to train students to translate ethically, taking into consideration all these elements like voice, silences, listening to what is said about traumas, memories, and so on and so on. students have a lot of difficulties, to innovate in their own practice, because they have to follow. They are assessed also for a specific type of translation, right? Which is all semantic, all textual, or faithful to the text, but at the same time properly designed for the Communication Act.
Yeah.
Trying to help the audience, right? Helping them to understand quickly, efficiently the meaning of the text. So I'm familiar with all of that. I'm very happy that you decided to discuss about this problem from the institutional point of view, because I think that's an element that is really missing in translation studies. They are researchers who tried to do research about translation within publishing. It's very difficult to make this type of research because they are blocked. No one, publishers don't want to open to the researchers, right? So there's
at the same time, what I think is happening, which is actually also does a complete disservice at large, is that when and I've seen this happening, so in recent publication, do you translate what it's not in your experience with this very narrow idea of identity politics that's that accrues. So can a white translator, should a white translator translate or not translate? And the issue is, and also this text itself. So the Gorman case was completely swept up in that identity politics. And it was, the choice of using a non-binary Dutch white translator sort of seemed to be like the winning thing on the part of the editor, the white writer, because it was a good corporate or marketing ploy. And then eventually it turned, and the journalist had just said, well, there must be kind of translators of colors that could do this. And then it simply got transformed or translated into this kind of narrow thing, who can or who cannot translate. And I want to kind of keep sort of referring to the fact that Philip is not so much saying that, is arguing for, so that she says more and more, there's definitely at one point to a wall off that happens once the correspondence, it's clear that the Italians continue to minimize and continue to kind of belong to the substantial acknowledgement of that ontic weight, the being that's being harmed. Philip says more than once that it's not about the people, it's not about the single individual involved, but it is about a logic by which a number of things happened that just sanctioned the fact that she did not need to be consulted, and it sanctioned the fact that those faces are just graphic renderings, have nothing to do with a cultural, spiritual otherness that exceeds. And one of the things that emerges was this is a debate that exceeds our typical foreignized versus domesticating strategies of translation. It requires another kind of sensibility in play, and one that also acknowledges transnational, again, that argument around the Italian minor language versus the English completely misrecognizes that Philip is writing in an alien language to herself. She writes more than once. Language is my languish. It's my anguish. English is anguish. It's my anguish language. It's my colonial. It's the Derrida. I have this language. This is my only language. This is a language that is not mine, and that's going to be the colonial predicament of living in translation. Even more so because you have that colonial predicament of being consigned to English by force of history, those silence become even more important. And there's no amount of domesticating or foreignizing that you do. You just need to respect them. That's where the decoloniality needs to be brought into the fray of the conversation. Also theory, because I'm seeing now the theory going towards, yeah, who has the right to translate? It's not just about that. And it's not primarily about that. Not primarily.
From your experience and contact and communication with the publisher and the translator, I would like to ask you, how do you see the translator in relationship with the publishing house? Can you say a few words about that specific?
So this is another kind of set of things. The Italian project itself was one, in fact, enabled that could have been, it was possible only because of candidates, to some extent. It is an independent small publisher, like all the things they say about restrictions it's correct. That they couldn't afford a number of things. This is not, I mean, this is poetry. This is not a big commercial operation. If anything, what I call the Pontius Pilate, I'm using a Christian reference. The person, the one actor in the whole thing that kind of was able to watch in front of it all was the American publisher. Because the American publisher, in fact, had, if anything, at all parts of the process, the American publishers the Italians expected the American publishers to have contacted or thought that the American publisher had contacted. It never happened. They didn't deem it necessary to, because she had signed translation rights. So the American publisher assumed that this was not something that she needed to know. And again, those are eventually. I know that the Wesleyan University Press then has taken steps to sort of redraft contracts so that authors are kept informed, or authors who want to know are kept informed of what is happening to the text. So again, a number of things, but within Italy, Moresi, as far as I understood, there's another guy, Andrea Raus, another poet. Moresi himself is a poet. These are poets, and Moresi has come to understand just the enormity of what happened. Like she's really kind of she offered herself to she distanced herself from the publishers. And she's still not engaging in any public anything because she's seeking the connection with God. She's really seeking. In terms of the treatment of the text, the written text, she did a decent work. But again, that's not the point. that's not the point. That's where the issue again continues to be fought.
So actually, there's something.
Susan, you wanted to say something?
Yeah.
Oh,
Oh, yeah, I mean, and
she should.
I'm sorry.
and I suspect, so I was supposed to write a piece in Italian, a more extended piece in Italian for an Italian, and I think an Italian intervention is actually more warranted than an English one, although I do think the English one too. And I didn't get my act together to send it, but I also was troubled because it was the Benway Press, the editors that are kind of trying to capitalize now on this and going to continue to produce. And in fact, there were other ways you refused to write for them. I said yes initially, and then I still feel I missed an opportunity, but that's Susan.
Yeah, no, I didn't want to continue or interrupt Aurelia. I just wanted to come back. I did have the opportunity to read your Italian contribution to get a sense of what, which is also why I'm so intrigued in this. And I was just what Eva so kindly said about my remarks. I was just really also very moved by what you're saying about how what the debate does to translation studies theories and how it exceeds foreignizing and domesticating. And I'm thinking, of course it does, right? Because there is this global aspect that I'm going to come back to it again. The mediatization brings in, even in something because just of exposure, right? I mean, whether it's social media, whatever, that's those new waters. And it just occurred to me, you used the word foreclosing, and I do think putting this in the frame of of listening, like who can, and quoting Derrida, like the Italian translator knows Derrida, you know Derrida, the publishing house doesn't, right? So who is able to hear what because of what they know? Theoretically, I think is really it's such a classic example of this. And can you hear me, because my headphones just
Yes, you can hear very well, yeah.
Okay, great. And so what I just wanted to encourage is to think about this, what kind of politics is involved. And to me, what's going on in Italy seems to be totally a politics of the present. And that's the kind of, because what Brian said too about it being a kind of excuse to miss or to ignore the colonial past. They are so caught up in these contemporary concerns about what's going on their middle. It's the Mediterranean is a la Midi, right? It's a middle passage of a kind in their context, and even that, but it's the view of it is not being encouraged to be approached historically. And I think that because the translator has come to understand that, that's where you see the possibilities for the kinds of care that you're trying, that can possibly be enacted in it. So
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Any other comment?
Other questions or comments?
Great.
There's a comment
In the chat.
In the chat.
Yes.
Check it.
If you're just trying to read what I put in the chat, it was that you shouldn't. I wasn't. They weren't my words. I was actually quoting from Elena's paper when she was talking about this. So that's all. No, from what she said today, but it draws on it. So yes, and I think it really was a great summary and establishes the context, Elena, in a really great way.
Yeah.
Elena, can I ask just one last question? When the publisher used utmost care in the letter, were they aware that Zong meant care?
No,
I really don't know. I think it's just because this translation as this is a contact zone as a site of equivocation, a deep equivocation. One part of my theorizing that I was trying to work through that I haven't done yet was actually to put this work in the context of Eduardo de Castro, who talks about equivocation in the context of indigenous settler relation in the Americas. And he talks about controlled equivocation and perspectivism, the need to kind of acknowledge that when you are engaged in practices of translation, this is in anthropology, with a number of indigenous peoples, you acknowledge not just their epistemologies, but in fact that what the word that they use, say for mountain, it actually implies a completely different reality. And this is again what those silences are gesturing to, that they imply another reality or another set of possibility, or something in fact that needs to be recuperated, because those indigenous African cosmologies are the cosmologies that were broken by the slave trade, that were entirely shattered by the Middle Passage. So in that also there's kind of this revendication that Philip does, like, no, the middle, like us in the Americas are not the same as and this speaks also to something around sort of the contemporary Black diaspora and how they are sort of articulating their own differences between the Americas and the continent and the new migration. So there's also that aspect that again reverberates and needs some degree of teasing apart of all the strands that are entangled in there. And again, yeah, Philip said one thing about the potential risk of hailing this masterpiece that the Italians say is so needed in Italy, is also to suck the energy out of local productions of texts that speak to the ongoing situation from the point of view of the people that are surviving that. There's at no point were Black Italians involved in any of this either. Right. That's another thing. If we want to, go the identity politics route, but that's just as important because it engages with a subjectivation as opposed to that mediatized objectivation of the perpetual victim. I see we got it out.
Yes, that's great. Such an interesting discussion, enriching, engaging.